Maybe you'd be more comfortable in your room, Mom. We didn't plan today for you, my daughter Megan told me. The oven hummed behind me. I had been up since 4:30 that morning, preparing the turkey, the stuffing the cranberry sauce from scratch. I stood in my own kitchen, a wooden spoon in my hand, staring at the child I had raised. "What did you say?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat. Megan sighed, shifting her weight. She wore a neat beige dress, holding her phone like a shield against reality. "It's just, Greg's business partners are coming over. It's a networking thing for his new venture. The vibe needs to be right. We just didn't plan for, family time tonight. My name is Catherine. I am 66 years old. I bought this house with my late husband 30 years ago. I paid off the mortgage 5 years ago. I bought the turkey roasting in the oven. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. Decades of life had taught me that getting loud only gives the other person a reason to call you crazy. Instead, I untied the strings of my heavy linen apron. I folded it neatly in half, then into quarters, and set it carefully on the granite countertop. "Mom, don't make this a thing," Megan muttered, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "Just grab a plate and head upstairs. I'll bring you dessert later." I walked right past her. I stepped out of the kitchen, crossed the hardwood floor of the dining room, and pulled out the heavy oak chair at the head of the table. The wood scraped loudly against the floorboards. I sat down, smoothing my skirt, and rested my hands gracefully on the placemat. Megan followed me, her face suddenly pale. "What are you doing?" "Waiting for my guests," I replied calmly. The doorbell rang. Greg walked briskly down the stairs, fixing his watch, completely unaware of the tension radiating from the dining room. He opened the front door, welcoming a rush of cold December air and 3 well-dressed couples. "Come on in, guys. Merry Christmas?" Greg chuckled, taking their heavy coats. Megan stood frozen in the dining room doorway, staring at me with wide eyes. I didn't break eye contact. I offered her a polite, closed-mouth smile. As the guests moved into the dining area, their chatter died down slightly upon seeing me seated comfortably at the head of the long table. "Oh, hello." A tall man in a navy sweater offered, looking slightly confused, but polite. Welcome to my home," I greeted, extending a hand without standing up. "I'm Catherine, Greg's mother-in-law. Please find a seat." Greg walked in, freezing the moment he saw me. He blinked rapidly, looking from me to Megan, who was now clutching the edge of the doorway as if she might faint. "Catherine," Greg stammered, his confident host persona fracturing. I thought, "Megan said you were tired." "Not at all." I answered, my tone incredibly pleasant. "I've been cooking since before dawn. I wouldn't dream of missing the dinner I prepared." The guests exchanged polite, slightly confused glances. A woman with a sleek bob smiled warmly. "It smells absolutely incredible in here. Thank you for hosting us, Catherine." "It's my pleasure." I nodded. "Megan, could you bring out the appetizers? The guests are waiting." Megan's jaw tightened. For a second, I saw the teenage rebellion flash in her eyes, the urge to stomp her foot and scream. But she was trapped by her own desperate need to impress these people. Of course, she forced out her voice, dangerously tight. As she turned back to the kitchen, Greg quickly guided everyone to their seats. He took the chair to my right, completely off balance. The control of the evening had shifted in less than 2 minutes, and I hadn't raised my voice once. Dinner was a masterclass in quiet dominance. I didn't monopolize the conversation, but I naturally anchored it. Every time Greg tried to pivot the talk strictly to his software startup, the guests organically looped me back in, complimenting the food or asking about the property. "This crown molding is fantastic," the tall man, Richard, noted, looking up at the ceiling. "Did you guys renovate recently?" My late husband and I did it in 1998. I shared passing the gravy boat to Richard's wife. It takes a lot of care to maintain an older home. You have to respect the foundation. I glanced at Megan. She was violently cutting a piece of turkey she hadn't taken a single bite of. Megan and Greg have been staying with me for the past 4 months. I continued casually sipping my water. It's been quite the adjustment having a full house again. Oh, house hunting. Richard's wife asked Greg with polite interest. Greg cleared his throat, his face flushing deep red. Yes. Saving up. The market is tough right now. It wasn't tough. Greg had quit his steady job to start a company that hadn't made a single dime, and Megan's part-time consulting barely covered their car payments. I had opened my doors out of love, expecting a temporary arrangement. Instead, they had slowly started treating me like a live-in maid. Well, it's incredibly generous of Catherine to open her home. Richard nodded respectfully toward me. Megan dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the fine china, my fine china. Mom is very particular about her space. Megan forced a tight laugh, desperately trying to regain control. We try to stay out of her way. You don't need to stay out of my way in my own home. Dear, I smiled gently. You just need to remember your place in it. The table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Richard took a long, slow sip of his wine. Greg looked like he wanted to sink into the floorboards. Megan glared at me, her cheeks burning red, finally realizing her little networking dinner was completely out of her hands. The guests left shortly after 9. They praised the meal, thanked me profusely, and barely spared a glance for Greg's printed business proposals sitting on the entryway table. The moment the front door clicked shut, the silence in the house turned heavy and sharp. I stood up, gathered 3 empty plates, and walked calmly into the kitchen. I turned on the hot water and reached for the dish soap. Megan stormed in right behind me. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "You completely humiliated us in front of investors." I rinsed a plate, watching the warm grease spiral down the drain. "I hosted the dinner I cooked. I told you we needed this night." She snapped, throwing a crumpled cloth napkin onto the clean counter. "You did that on purpose to sabotage Greg." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly on a towel. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was 32, wearing a designer dress, living rent-free and yelling at the woman who bought the very food she just served. "Megan." I started my voice perfectly steady. "You invited strangers into my home, expected me to cater it, and then told me to go hide in my bedroom." It was one night. It was the final night, I corrected. Greg walked into the kitchen, rubbing his temples. "Look, Catherine Megan was stressed. The delivery was bad. Okay, let's just cool off." "I am perfectly cool, Greg," I replied. I folded the towel. "But this arrangement is over. You have until January 31st to find a new place to live." Megan laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the cabinets. "You're kicking us out. In the middle of winter, over a dinner, I am giving you 5 weeks' notice to relocate," I stated. "It isn't about the dinner. It's about the fact that you have forgotten whose roof is over your head. I suggest you start packing tomorrow." I walked past them, turned off the kitchen light, and headed up the stairs. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I woke at my usual 6 o'clock, made a pot of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop. Megan and Greg were under the illusion that my boundary was a bluff. They thought I would wake up, feel guilty, and offer to make pancakes to smooth things over. They didn't understand that once a mother's patience breaks, it doesn't glue itself back together overnight. I opened my router settings on my computer. Over the past 4 months, Greg had set up a massive gaming and work rig in the spare room, constantly hogging the bandwidth. I clicked a few buttons, changed the primary Wi-Fi password, and created a new network named guest.access. I throttled the speed to a basic level enough to check emails, but not enough to stream movies or run heavy software. At 9, Greg shuffled into the kitchen, staring down at his phone. "Did the internet go down?" he mumbled, pouring himself a mug of coffee. "No," I took a sip of mine. "I updated the network. The new password is on the fridge." He glanced at the sticky note, typed it in, and frowned. "This is really slow, Catherine. I have important video meetings today. You'll have to manage or find a local coffee shop," I answered without looking up from my screen. "The high-speed line is reserved for the homeowner." He stared at me slowly, realizing I wasn't joking. Megan came downstairs 10 minutes later, dressed in expensive athletic wear. She grabbed a banana and glared at me. "Are we still doing this silent treatment thing?" "There is no silent treatment," I replied calmly. "I am just busy organizing my finances." "Right," she rolled her eyes. "Look, Mom, I'm going to the organic market later. I'll pick up some things for the week." "Don't buy anything for me," I noted. Whatever, she grabbed her keys and walked out. She didn't know I had already logged into my banking portal. The supplemental credit card I had given her for emergency household items was already deactivated. The real lesson was about to begin at the checkout counter. My phone buzzed at exactly 11:40. The caller ID flashed Megan's name. I let it ring twice before casually swiping to answer. "Mom, my card was declined," she barked, immediately, panic lacing her voice. "I'm standing at the register with a full cart." "Did you forget to pay the bill?" "The bill is paid," I answered casually, wiping down the kitchen counters with a sponge. "I canceled the authorized user card this morning." Silence stretched over the line, save for the background noise of grocery store scanners beeping continuously. "You canceled it," she whispered furiously. "Without telling me. How am I supposed to pay for this? With your own money, Megan. You are 32 years old. I don't have my debit card on me. You're humiliating me." "Then leave the cart and come home," I suggested mildly. "Or call your husband to bring his card." "You are being so petty," she hissed into the receiver. "I am being financially responsible?" I corrected, maintaining my even tone. "I am no longer funding your household. I'll see you when you get back." I hung up and placed the phone face down on the counter. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt a quiet, solid resolve. For months, I had justified the expenses. She's my daughter. They're struggling. But buying $200 of luxury snacks while telling me to eat in my bedroom wasn't a struggle. It was pure exploitation. When Megan finally burst through the front door an hour later, empty-handed, her face was blotchy with anger. "You did that to punish me," she accused, throwing her leather purse onto the sofa. "I did it because the card was meant for my household expenses, not yours," I replied from the armchair, turning a page of my book. "Since you are moving out in 4 weeks, it made perfectly logical sense to separate our finances now." She stood there, fists clenched, realizing for the very first time that my deadline wasn't an empty threat. It was a strict schedule, and the countdown had already started. By the first week of January, the reality of their situation began to set in, but Megan was still trying to subtly cling to her territory. Over the months, she had slowly replaced my things with hers. My floral throw pillows were swapped for her minimalist gray ones. My framed family photos in the hallway were moved to a back closet to make room for her abstract modern art prints. It was a quiet, insidious erasure of my presence in my own home. On a Tuesday afternoon while they were both upstairs, I went to the storage closet. I pulled out my heavy embroidered throw pillows and placed them firmly back on the living room sofa. I took down her abstract canvas in the hallway, leaned it against the wall, and meticulously rehung the family portraits I cherished. I found her expensive, oversized scented candles scattered on my dining table, and placed them efficiently into a cardboard box labeled Megan's Things. Greg came down for a glass of water and stopped dead in the hallway, looking at the family photos. "You're redecorating?" he asked cautiously. "I'm restoring," I corrected gently. "I prefer my home the way it was." He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the cardboard box resting on the table. "Catherine, I've been looking at apartments. Prices are steep out there. We might need a little more time." I poured him a glass of water from the fridge and handed it to him. "February 1st is the date, Greg. I suggest you lower your expectations on the apartment size and location." "Megan isn't handling this well," he admitted, staring down into the glass. "Megan is an adult," I reminded him. "She will adapt, but she will not adapt here." He didn't argue. He just drank the water and quietly retreated upstairs. Greg was inherently passive, always waiting for someone else to make the hard choices. I realized then that I was actually doing them a favor. By forcing them out, I was forcing them to finally grow up. I sealed the cardboard box with packing tape and pushed it neatly toward the stairs. Desperation breeds predictable tactics. When Megan realized I wouldn't budge on the move-out date or the finances, she dialed for backup. My sister Diane called me on a Sunday evening. Diane has always been dramatic, easily swayed by a tearful phone call and a one-sided story. "Catherine, what on earth is going on?" Diane demanded as soon as I picked up. "Megan is crying, saying you're throwing her out on the street over a silly misunderstanding at Christmas." I sat comfortably in my favorite armchair sipping chamomile tea. "She's not on the street, Diane. She's in my spare bedroom and she has until the end of the month to sign a lease. But she's your daughter. They're having a tough time. You have that huge house all to yourself. Surely you can compromise." "There is no compromise on respect," I answered calmly. "You're going to ruin your relationship with her over pride." Diane pushed her voice tightening with judgment. "If enforcing a basic boundary ruins the relationship, then the relationship was already broken," I stated. "I love Megan, but I will not be a guest in my own life to make her comfortable." "Well, I think you're being incredibly harsh," Diane huffed. "You're welcome to let them move in with you, Diane," I offered lightly. "I'm sure they'd appreciate your guest room." There was a sudden, heavy pause on the line. Well, Jim's back is bad, and we don't really have the space." Diane stammered, backtracking instantly. "I understand completely." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Have a good night, Diane." I hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, Megan came downstairs glaring at me. She knew her aunt had failed. The invisible army she tried to build had collapsed at the first sign of actual responsibility. The final week of January brought a frantic, nervous energy to the house. The reality they had tried so hard to ignore was now stacked in cardboard boxes near the front door. They had found a small 2-bedroom apartment a few towns over. It wasn't the luxury loft Megan felt she deserved, but it was exactly what they could afford without my credit card. I didn't help them pack. I didn't offer to hire a moving van. I simply continued my daily routine, maintaining a polite, neutral distance. On Thursday evening, Greg found me in the kitchen while I was making dinner. "We're moving the big furniture on Saturday morning," he announced, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Noted," I said, focusing on chopping vegetables. He lingered by the counter. "Catherine, I'm sorry about how this all went down. I should have spoken up more. I let things get out of hand." I stopped chopping and looked at him. "Yes, you did. But apologies don't change the past, Greg. They only inform the future. I hope you remember that in your new home." He nodded, looking deeply ashamed. "I'll make sure the spare room is left spotless." Megan avoided me entirely. She packed her clothes in angry silence, slamming doors and stomping heavily up the stairs. She wanted me to react. She desperately wanted a screaming match to justify her victimhood and prove I was the villain. But I gave her nothing but the calm, steady presence of a homeowner waiting for her tenants to leave. I wasn't angry anymore. The initial sting of Christmas dinner had faded into a cold, clear reality. I had spent my entire life taking care of people. It was time to stop pouring my energy into cups that actively chose to leak. Saturday morning was gray and brutally cold. A rented white box truck sat idling in my driveway. Greg carried out the heavy boxes, while Megan hauled the smaller items wrapped in thick scarves. They worked steadily for 3 hours. I sat on the front porch, wearing a thick knitted sweater, holding a warm mug of black coffee, quietly watching the process. Finally, Greg closed the back of the truck and locked the heavy metal latch. He walked up the porch steps, pausing slightly, and handed me the 2 spare house keys. "That's everything," he sighed, looking exhausted. "Thank you, Catherine." "Really?" I took the keys, dropping them securely into my pocket. "Good luck with the business, Greg." Megan walked up behind him. She looked at the house, then at me. There was no apology in her eyes, just a lingering resentment mixed with a forced sense of pride. "We'll invite you over once we're settled," she muttered intentionally, not meeting my gaze. "Take your time," I replied pleasantly. "Focus on yourselves right now." She hesitated, waiting for the motherly embrace, the tearful goodbye, the traditional, "Call me when you get there." I offered a polite, firm nod instead. They walked to their car, got in, and drove away, the moving truck lumbering behind them. I stood on the porch for a long moment, listening to the engine fade down the suburban street. Then I turned and walked back inside. The house was incredibly quiet. The heavy, suffocating energy that had clung to the walls for months was entirely gone. I walked through the hallway, tracing the frames of my family portraits. I walked into the living room, straightening my beautiful floral pillows. I went into the kitchen, picked up the apron I had taken off on Christmas Day, and hung it proudly back on its designated hook. I didn't lose a daughter. I just gained my life back. I walked over to the front door, turned the deadbolt until it clicked and smiled.